In a world where trade is the lifeblood of economies, one decision changed everything. When President Donald Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs, it sent shockwaves through the U.S. and across the globe. What seemed like a bold plan to protect American jobs soon turned into a trade war, one that could reshape the global economy. As prices rose, businesses struggled, and countries clashed. The world held its breath, asking, would this help the U.S., or would it bring more harm than good? The story of the tariffs had only just begun, and its end was still uncertain. Chapter 1. A New Era in Trade, the Liberation Day Tariffs. President Donald Trump stood in front of the American people with a bold message. His voice was full of confidence as he declared, "We are going to win on trade." It was a promise he made to the American workers, to the farmers, to the builders, to everyone who felt like their jobs were being taken away. For years, Trump believed, the U.S. had been losing in trade. Other countries, especially China, were taking advantage of the system. The result? American businesses were suffering. Jobs were going overseas, and it seemed like there was nothing anyone could do about it. But now, Trump had a plan. He introduced what he called the Liberation Day tariffs. These were special taxes placed on goods coming into the U.S. from other countries. The idea was simple: make things from other countries more expensive, and people would choose to buy American-made products instead. These tariffs are going to bring back American jobs, Trump promised. But not everyone agreed. Many people in the U.S. were unsure. What would happen if other countries got angry? Would they retaliate? Would it hurt American businesses in the long run? The tariffs were aimed at countries like China, Canada, and Mexico. Steel, aluminum, electronics, anything that came into the U.S. from these countries would now cost more. Trump said this was the only way to fight back. America first, he shouted. It was a call to arms, a promise to put U.S. interests above all else. Still, the question remained, was this the right decision? Some people were excited. They believed that if foreign products were more expensive, it would encourage people to buy American. More jobs would be created in factories and industries. This would help the U.S. economy, Trump said. But others were nervous. They wondered, would this cause more harm than good? Take farmers, for example. They depended on exports. Many of their products, like soybeans, pork, and wheat, were sold to countries like China and Mexico. But now, with the tariffs in place, these countries were going to raise their own taxes on U.S. goods. What would happen to the American farmer? Would they lose customers? And then there were the consumers, the people who bought clothes, electronics, cars, and food. What would happen when those prices went up? Would they feel the pinch too? It didn't take long for the world to react. Other countries weren't happy. They said they would fight back. China, for example, promised to impose tariffs on American goods. Mexico and Canada did the same. It was a trade war, and the battlefield was the global market. Now, the American people were waiting to see what would happen next. Could these tariffs really make America great again? Or would they end up hurting the very people they were meant to help? There was no clear answer. The story of the Liberation Day tariffs was just beginning, and already it was filled with tension, uncertainty, and a lot of questions. What would the future hold? Would the trade war end quickly, or would it drag on? One thing was for sure. Nothing in the world of trade was ever going to be the same again. Chapter 2. The target countries, China, Canada, and Mexico. When President Trump introduced the Liberation Day tariffs, it wasn't just a message to the American people. It was a message to the world. And the countries that were hit hardest, China, Canada, and Mexico. Let's start with China. For years, China had been America's largest trading partner. But Trump believed that China was taking advantage of the U.S. He said China's trade practices were unfair. They made things in huge amounts, but often didn't play by the same rules that other countries followed. So, Trump decided to make a big move. He placed tariffs, taxes on many products from China. Electronics, steel, aluminum, you name it. These goods became more expensive for Americans. The goal? To force China to change its ways. We need to make deals that benefit America, not just China, Trump said. He believed that by hurting China's economy, they would come to the table for new, fairer agreements. But China didn't stay quiet. They quickly responded. "We'll fight back," they declared. Next, there was Canada. Canada had been America's neighbor and trade partner for decades. But the new tariffs also targeted Canadian goods. Lumber, cars, agricultural products, everything was now more expensive. For example, American builders, who depended on Canadian lumber, suddenly faced higher costs. Canada's leaders were upset. "We don't want a trade war. We want fair trade," they said. But the tariffs were already in place, and it was too late to stop them. The two countries were now in a difficult situation. American companies were struggling, and Canada felt the pressure as well. And then, Mexico. Mexico, like Canada, was a close neighbor to the United States. They had a long history of trading with each other, but the tariffs affected them too. Mexico relied on the U.S. to buy many of its products. Cars, vegetables, and other goods were all affected by the new taxes. Mexico didn't take this lightly. They were worried about their economy. How can we continue trading with the U.S. if the costs are too high? Many Mexican leaders asked. They didn't want to lose the jobs and businesses that depended on trade with America. The situation was tense. China, Canada, and Mexico were all worried. They feared that these tariffs would hurt their own economies. What happens next? They asked. Would they find a way to fix this? Or would the trade war continue? And in the U.S., people were also asking questions. The tariffs were meant to protect American jobs, But what about the people who worked in industries that depended on foreign goods? What about the consumers, the everyday shoppers, who were now facing higher prices? As the story unfolded, it became clear. This wasn't just about the U.S. anymore. The world was watching. Every country affected by these tariffs had their own concerns, their own fears about what would happen next. Will we reach a deal? Was the question on everyone's mind. It wasn't just about products or numbers on a page. It was about people's lives, their jobs, and their futures. And the answers? Well, they were still uncertain. Chapter 3. Global Reactions. A Shock to the System. The moment President Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs, the world took notice. It was a bold move, and people everywhere began to feel the shockwaves. In the United States, the news spread quickly. Stock prices, which had been rising for months, suddenly dropped. Investors looked at the tariffs and felt uncertain. They worried about how the new taxes would affect businesses, both in the U.S. and around the world. Companies that relied on products from China, Canada, and Mexico saw their shares fall. What happens now? They asked. They didn't know the answer. No one did. Across the globe, other governments were paying close attention. In China, officials quickly made their position clear. We will retaliate, they warned. China wasn't going to sit back quietly. They had their own tariffs ready, aimed at American products. They would raise taxes on U.S. goods like soybeans, cars, and more. The trade war was now real, and the question was, how long would it last? Canada and Mexico were also preparing to fight back. Their leaders had the same message. We won't let this hurt our economies. They quickly put tariffs on goods coming from the U.S. like steel, pork, and even ketchup. It felt like the entire world was now involved in a global struggle. But what did all this mean for the U.S. economy? Would these tariffs really help, or would they cause even more problems? People across the U.S. started asking themselves these questions. On one hand, the tariffs were meant to bring jobs back to America, to protect industries that had been struggling. Trump had promised that this would help the American worker. But there were worries, too. Many American companies relied on cheaper goods from other countries. What would happen if those goods became more expensive? In stores, prices began to rise. Consumers felt it. The cost of everyday items, clothes, electronics, even food, went up. People started wondering if this would hurt their wallets. And what about the farmers? They had always sent their crops to China and Mexico, but with new tariffs in place, these countries might not buy as much from the U.S. That meant American farmers might not get the prices they were used to. So, what was going to happen next? The world watched, uncertain. Would these tariffs strengthen the U.S. economy, or would they hurt it? Would they make the global economy stronger, or would they cause chaos? No one knew for sure. Everyone was waiting for answers. And as the days went by, the pressure started to build. The news was full of updates. Every country was reacting. Every business was trying to figure out how to adjust. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Would the tariffs lead to new trade deals? Or would they create a bigger mess? Only time would tell. But for now, the world had entered uncharted territory. The future was full of questions, and no one had the answers. Chapter 4. The impact on U.S. industries, winners and losers. When President Trump introduced the Liberation Day tariffs, he promised that they would bring jobs and help the U.S. economy. But as the days went by, it became clear that the impact wasn't the same for every industry. Some industries found new hope. Take steel, for example. For years, the U.S. steel industry had been struggling. Cheap steel from other countries made it hard for American steel factories to compete. But now, with the new tariffs in place, foreign steel became more expensive. Suddenly, American steel was looking more competitive. "This is our chance," said many steel workers. More people started buying American-made steel, and factories began to see a rise in orders. For some, the tariffs were a lifeline. But for others, the story was very different. Farmers, in particular, were hit hard. They had always relied on countries like China and Mexico to buy their crops. Soybeans, pork, wheat, and other products were sold to these countries in large quantities. But now, with tariffs on U.S. goods, China and Mexico weren't buying as much. "What happened?" asked many farmers staring at their empty fields. Prices for their crops and animals started to drop. Soybeans, which had once sold for a good price, now weren't worth as much. Farmers worried. Will we be able to survive this? Some even had to throw away their crops because they couldn't sell them. It wasn't just the farmers who were struggling. Many industries in the U.S. relied on products from other countries. For example, car manufacturers who used parts from China or Mexico now faced higher costs. Cars became more expensive, and people were buying fewer of them. The situation was tough. Some industries were winning, but many were losing. "Why are we being hurt?" asked the workers in these industries. They wanted to support America, but they also needed affordable goods to run their businesses. Without those goods, they couldn't keep their factories open or their workers employed. It was clear no one was unaffected by the tariffs. The winners and losers were divided. Some were happy, while others felt the weight of the new reality. And in the background, there was the question that no one could ignore. Would the benefits to some industries last, or would the losses in others bring everything crashing down? As the weeks passed, the full impact of the tariffs started to show. Some industries saw growth, but many saw their profits vanish. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even close to being easy. The people of the U.S. had to wait and see. Would the benefits of the tariffs reach everyone? Or would they continue to divide the country into winners and losers? Chapter 5. American consumers feel the pressure. While some industries in the U.S. saw benefits from the new tariffs, there was one group that couldn't ignore the changes: the American consumers. It started slowly at first. At the grocery store, shoppers noticed that the prices of everyday items were creeping up. A can of soup, a box of cereal, just a little more expensive than before. People shrugged, thinking it was nothing to worry about. But soon, it wasn't just a can of soup. Clothing, electronics, even the cost of a new phone or TV, the prices were rising. "What's going on?" people asked as they looked at the prices. Some of their favorite brands were now too expensive. They began to realize the tariffs were making things more expensive. Imported goods were now subject to higher taxes. Things that came from China, Mexico, and Canada, whether it was clothing or electronics, were harder to afford. "Why are prices so high?" people asked. The answer was simple, but it wasn't what they wanted to hear. The tariffs were the cause. These taxes on foreign goods had caused prices to rise for everyone. Imagine walking into your favorite store. You've been saving up for a new jacket, or maybe you've been waiting to buy a new phone. But when you look at the price tag, you stop. It's higher than you expected. This is too much, you think. You start to wonder if you can still afford it. I just want to buy what I need, you think. But now everything seems more expensive. For millions of people, this became the reality. Shoppers began to complain. They weren't happy. They wanted to know why everything was more expensive. And when they learned that it was the tariffs, they started to feel frustrated. "I don't want to pay more," many said. But what could they do? Prices were rising, and it wasn't just the grocery store. It was everywhere. It was the car dealership, the electronics store, even the clothes store. Things that used to be affordable were now out of reach for many families. Some consumers didn't know how to deal with it. They had to make tough choices. Maybe they couldn't buy the new phone they wanted. Maybe they had to skip the weekend trip because everything was just too expensive. And it wasn't just the cost of things. They were also worried about what was coming next. If the tariffs stayed in place, would prices keep going up? How long could they keep up with this? As the weeks passed, the pressure on consumers only grew. People were feeling the squeeze. The cost of living was rising, and wages weren't going up as fast. This isn't what I expected, many thought. In the back of their minds, they wondered, would things ever get better? Or was this the new normal? The tariffs had changed more than just the economy. They had changed daily life. And for many Americans, it felt like the pressure was only going to grow. Chapter 6. The Effect on International Relations. The new tariffs didn't just affect businesses. They shook the very foundations of international relations. Countries like China, Mexico, and Canada were angry. They felt betrayed, as if the U.S. had broken the rules of a fair trade game. They believed they had been treated unfairly. "How can they do this to us?" Chinese leaders asked. They couldn't understand why the U.S. had imposed such heavy tariffs on their goods. In response, they vowed to fight back. "We will retaliate," they said. And retaliate they did. China, like many others, began imposing its own tariffs on American products: soybeans, pork, and cars, just a few of the things China stopped buying. The U.S. was feeling the effects immediately. Farmers saw their exports shrink. American companies began to lose customers. What had been a smooth relationship was now becoming a battlefield. But it wasn't just China. Mexico and Canada, two of the U.S.'s closest neighbors, were also upset. They depended on trade with the U.S., but now they were being hit by tariffs as well. "This isn't fair," Canadian leaders said. "We've always been good neighbors." But it didn't matter. The U.S. tariffs were now a reality, and Canada and Mexico had to respond. They imposed tariffs on American goods too, and suddenly friendly trade relationships were strained. What had once been open borders and mutual agreements was now a trade war. This made it harder for businesses everywhere to know what to expect. One day, prices were low, and the next day, they were high. Rules that had been in place for decades were now being changed without warning. The simple idea of trading goods across borders became more complicated than ever. Business owners started to wonder, how could they plan for the future? If tariffs were going to change the cost of goods overnight, how could they know what to expect? Many companies found themselves uncertain. Would they have to pay more for the things they needed? Would customers start to buy less because prices were going up? Or would the tariffs push countries to make new deals that would improve things? There were no easy answers. People around the world began to ask, what does this mean for the future of global trade? No one knew for sure. The balance had shifted. What had been a system of cooperation and understanding now seemed like a battlefield. Some believed that the tariffs would force countries to negotiate better deals. Others feared it would lead to years of tension, even conflict. The global economy was like a giant puzzle, and the tariffs had thrown the pieces into the air. Would the pieces fall back into place, or would they be forever scattered? For now, it was unclear. But one thing was certain. The world of international trade would never be the same again. Chapter 7. Breaking News. The Future of U.S. Tariffs. As the months went by, the news about the tariffs kept changing. It seemed like every day brought a new update. One moment, there were talks about whether the tariffs would be removed or even increased. The future was unclear. For a while, there was hope. There were rumors of a deal between the U.S. and China. Maybe this will end soon, people thought. But as the weeks passed, it became obvious that the trade war wasn't close to being over. The news was filled with updates about the tariffs. It was on TV, in newspapers, and online. Every headline seemed to ask the same question: what will happen next? Some companies in the U.S. were adjusting to the new tariffs. They had to find new suppliers, raise prices, or find ways to make their products cheaper. Some were doing okay, but others were struggling to survive. They couldn't keep up with the rising costs, and some businesses were forced to close their doors. It felt like a never-ending roller coaster for many business owners. "How can we survive this?" asked one small business owner. "The tariffs are hurting us. We can't keep up with the price hikes." On the other hand, there were those who managed to find new opportunities. For example, some U.S. manufacturers started making products that they had once imported from other countries. "At least we're making things here again," they said. There was a feeling of pride in bringing jobs back to America, even if it came with challenges. But even with these small victories, the future was still uncertain. Would these changes really help the U.S. economy in the long run? Or would the country face years of problems and conflict with its trading partners? Meanwhile, the rest of the world was also waiting. China, Mexico, and Canada were still struggling with the new tariffs. They didn't know if the U.S. would ever remove the taxes or if they would continue to raise them. Trade relations remained tense, and global businesses weren't sure how to plan for the future. "How can we keep trading like this?" asked many foreign leaders. "We need to know what the rules are." The trade war had created a kind of waiting game. People were anxious. They wanted answers, but the future was still unclear. Some hoped the tariffs would end soon, but others feared they would drag on for years. It wasn't just businesses that were feeling the stress. The workers who depended on these industries were worried too. Would their jobs survive? Would their wages go down? Would they still have work tomorrow? The tension grew with every passing day. Everyone was asking the same question. What will happen next? And the truth was, no one knew. The story of the tariffs was still unfolding. The world was watching closely, waiting to see what the future would bring. Would there be peace? Or would the trade war continue to hurt businesses, workers, and nations? As the news changed, one thing remained the same. The world was still waiting for answers. And, in that waiting, the future of U.S. tariffs hung in the balance. Chapter 8. Experts weigh in. What does the future hold? As the months passed, many experts began to share their opinions about the tariffs. Some were optimistic, believing that these tariffs could help the U.S. economy in the long run. They said that, by making foreign goods more expensive, American-made products would be more competitive. This, they argued, would bring jobs back to the U.S. and help industries like steel grow stronger again. "It's a new beginning," said one economist. "This is our chance to bring back jobs and create new industries in America." But not everyone agreed. Many other experts warned that the tariffs might cause more harm than good. They pointed out that, while certain industries might benefit, other parts of the economy could suffer, and the consequences might spread far beyond the U.S. borders. One economist explained it like this: "The tariffs are like a double-edged sword. They might protect some American jobs, but they could hurt consumers and other industries." It was hard to argue with that. If foreign goods became more expensive, then everyone, especially consumers, would have to pay higher prices. That would hurt people who were already struggling with the cost of living. And what about industries that depended on cheap goods from other countries? Would they survive if prices went up? Other experts were even more concerned. They feared that the trade war could lead to a slowdown in the global economy. If countries keep retaliating, it could create a chain reaction, said one financial analyst. The global market could shrink, trade could slow down, and businesses everywhere would feel the pressure. These experts weren't just talking about money. They were talking about people's lives. Jobs could be lost, businesses could close, and countries could find themselves in deep economic trouble. As the debate continued, the uncertainty only grew. No one knew for sure what would happen next. Would the tariffs protect American workers, or would they lead to even more problems? Would the U.S. economy grow stronger, or would the trade war leave it weaker? The tension was palpable. For every expert who believed the tariffs would help, there was another who warned of the dangers. Everyone seemed to have a different opinion, and every opinion was backed up with facts, statistics, and predictions. But in the end, the only thing that was certain was that no one could predict the future. The story of the tariffs was still unfolding, and as each day passed, it became clear that the world was holding its breath, waiting for answers. What would the future hold? Would the tariffs succeed in bringing jobs and prosperity to the U.S.? Or would they cause a ripple effect that hurt the global economy? For now, the world could only wait and watch as the drama of the trade war continued to play out. Chapter 9. The world waited for answers. It had been months since the Liberation Day tariffs were announced. People everywhere were asking the same questions. Would the tariffs help or hurt the U.S. economy? Would they lead to more jobs, or would they cause more problems for workers and businesses? Would the trade war end soon, or would it continue to drag on, year after year? At the moment, no one could say for sure. No one knew. The future seemed uncertain, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next twist in this never-ending story. The news came in waves. One day, there were reports about new trade deals, and people were hopeful. The next day, there was news of more tariffs, and the fear grew. It felt like the world was in a constant state of waiting, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear. The world of trade was always changing. The Liberation Day tariffs were just one chapter in a much bigger story. They were a part of the shifting tides of global trade, a wave that could push economies in unexpected directions. This was a time of uncertainty, but also of possibility. Would the U.S. be able to rewrite the rules of trade in its favor? Or would the tariffs cause too much damage to the global economy? As the U.S. navigated this new trade landscape, it became clear that things were not going to stay the same. The rules of trade were being rewritten, and it wasn't just the U.S. that would be affected. The entire world was watching closely. Every decision made by President Trump and his team would have ripples far beyond the borders of the U.S. What happened in Washington could change the way countries interacted with each other for years to come. Businesses, workers, and governments all had to adjust. Every new tariff brought uncertainty. Every new deal brought hope. But in the end, no one knew if the world was moving toward a stronger global economy or a weaker one. As the world waited for answers, there was one truth that couldn't be ignored. Things were changing. They were changing in ways no one could have predicted, and no one could say where those changes would lead. Would the U.S. emerge stronger from this trade war? Or would the pain from the tariffs leave lasting scars on the economy? Would countries learn to work together again? Or would they remain in conflict for years to come? Only time would tell.